Hi, 6th grade. Way back when, before spring break, we started talking about rocks. Chapter 5 is all about rocks. Now, in some ways, rocks are very similar to the minerals that we were talking about in Chapter 4. They're inorganic. They're not made of living things by and large. They are solids, right? So we know that rocks and minerals have a lot in common, but we learned in section 1 that one way that rocks and minerals are different is that rocks have different chemical compositions, whereas minerals do not. So a rock is really just a whole bunch of minerals and sometimes some other substances too, all mashed together. Here we have two examples of rock. So this is a sample of granite, and this is a sample of a rock called conglomerate. You can tell pretty easily in both of these samples that they're made up of a variety of different substances all combined together. Now, because rocks have different chemical compositions, scientists aren't able to identify them using those same characteristic properties that we used for minerals. The best property to look at when we're trying to determine one rock from another is called texture. And in section 1, we talked about 3 different types of textures that you can look for, 3 different hallmarks of texture that you can look for when you're examining rocks. When we're talking about the texture of a rock, what we're talking about are the characteristics of all of those little pieces that are combined together. We call those little pieces in a rock grains. So when we look at these 2 pieces of rock here, our sample of quartz and our sample of conglomerate, we can tell a lot just on our first glance about those grains, those tiny pieces that make the rock up. In our piece of granite here, we notice that those different grains have different colors to them. The dark grain that we see in the piece of granite is actually quartz, and then there are some lighter grains too. There's like almost a tan or beige grain here too, that's feldspar. So those are 2 different minerals that again are packed very closely together in my one piece of granite. Over here in my piece of conglomerate, I noticed that my grains are very large and they sort of look like a bunch of pebbles that were at some point in time cemented together. So 2 different types of grains, 2 different types of rocks. There are 3 ways that we're going to identify texture. The first is by grain size. And in this case, both my granite and my conglomerate have very large pieces of material that make them up. They have very large grains. We can see the difference between all of these grains just by glancing at them. So we're going to call these coarse-grained rocks. We have grains that are very easy to distinguish between. Here I have a piece of sandstone. Now sandstone is a fine-grained rock. That means that the little pieces of mineral that make this rock up are so small that at first glance, I'm not going to be able to tell much about one compared to another. If I were to look at this rock under a hand lens, under a magnifying glass, or even under a more powerful microscope, I'm now going to be able to identify all those different parts and pieces, what they look like, and a little bit more about perhaps what they are. So this would be an example of a fine-grained rock. This would be an example of a coarse-grained rock. There are some other rocks that form in a unique way, so that they actually have no grain, no visible grain at all. This is an example of a rock called obsidian. Now obsidian forms from molten material. It's an igneous rock, and it cools so quickly that the little crystals that make up grains don't have a chance to form at all. So even if you were to look at this piece of obsidian under a powerful microscope, you're not going to see the same grains that you do in the other 3 samples here. So this is a rare example of a rock that actually has no visible grain compared to fine grain and coarse grain. In addition to looking at the size of grains, we can also look at the shape of those grains. We can look at the shape of the crystals that make up a rock. Comparing the conglomerate and the quartz or the granite one more time, you'll notice in the granite sample that all of these different rocks that make up the whole are sort of jagged in their shape. You can see, especially with the black quartz here, that it's kind of got lots of jagged lines. Compare that to the sample of conglomerate. Notice that most of these grains are rounded. They sort of look like pebbles that have been tossed in a stream. So rounded versus jagged grain shape is another way that you can tell 2 different rock samples apart. The third thing that you can look at in terms of texture is grain pattern. Now, in my sample of granite here, you'll notice that all of these different grains are sort of randomly organized throughout the rock. there isn't a great rhyme or reason to why the black quartz is where it is and why the more beige or pink feldspar is where it is. Compare that to this sample, I didn't have one that I could bring in, so I printed it off, of a rock called gneiss. Now, in some ways, these are similar. There's actually quartz and feldspar in the sample of gneiss as well, but instead of the pieces being arranged in a random order, now notice how all of these pieces of feldspar appear to be in lines. Now, they might not be exactly straight lines, but I can follow the path of this line with my finger all the way from one side of the rock to the other. We call this type of a grain pattern a banded pattern. So my sample of gneiss is a banded rock. That means that all of those layers of quartz crystal, those layers of feldspar crystal, they're organized in rows. My example of granite here is a non-banded rock. You notice that those pieces of feldspar and quartz are arranged in a random order. So again, there are three ways that we can organize texture. We can organize texture by grain size. Here we have fine or coarse-grained rock. We can see the grains easily. Here we have an example of a fine-grained rock. The particles are so small, it's hard to tell one from another. Sometimes rocks have no visible grain. That means that they cooled so quickly that the crystals didn't have a chance to form at all. The second thing we can look at is grain shape. We notice that there can be grains sometimes that are rounded, and then other times there can be grains that are jagged. The final piece of texture that we'll look at is the arrangement of those particles, the pattern of the particles. A rock may have a banded structure to it, meaning that those particles line up in rows, or it may have a non-banded pattern to it, which means that those different parts and pieces, those crystals, are arranged in a random order. Now it's your turn to take a look at some rock samples. I'm going to have you go outside, find a rock, any old rock will do, clean it up well enough that you can start to see some of these neat things that are happening inside it, all those crystals, those minerals that make it up, and see if you can identify the texture of your rock. Is it fine-grained or coarse-grained? Can you identify, are those grains jagged or smooth? And then lastly, see if you can find any bands in your rock. Maybe you can, maybe you can't. If you can't, I would call it non-banded for today. If you have questions, let me know. Remember that we are meeting in a Google Hangout this afternoon, so if you have questions, that would be a great opportunity for you to ask them.